Once upon a time, there was this place called Laurel Canyon. And if you had been fortunate enough in the mid to late 60s to have lived there, you would have found yourself among the most magical of people. Artists, musicians, writers, singers, painters, in this idyllic setting, maybe 5 minutes away from the Sunset Strip, but in a world, in a universe unto itself. Laurel Canyon was both a place to live and it was a state of mind.
What was it about the place that drew all of these creative people to it?
What was it about Laurel Canyon that drew all these creative people to it? It's a very profound question, one after all these years I still don't have an answer for. In France, in Paris, it was the Left Bank. In New York City, it was Greenwich Village. In Los Angeles, it was Laurel Canyon. What was it that attracted some of the brightest, most creative, most innovative people of our time to that small piece of land? Well, if you're an old Laurel Canyonite, the answer is simple. It was the magic of Laurel Canyon.
Very nice. And what were you doing at the time?
I was on the radio. I interviewed people. I did talk shows on various radio stations, and I primarily interviewed musicians and actors and actresses, and that was my occupation. But like most people who lived in Laurel Canyon, their occupation was an extension of their lifestyle. They would make music and they would rehearse in Laurel Canyon, and they would go out and play in little clubs in hopes that they would be discovered. I think on my radio shows I interviewed most of my neighbors. I just called them and said, would you like to come on the radio show and do that? So for me it was part broadcasting in between unemployment checks.
Gotcha. So did you kind of find yourself suddenly in the midst of all of this, or was it just something that organically grew and it wasn't until later on in life that you looked back and went, wow, I can't believe all that happened?
I moved to Los Angeles in 1963, and I think I rented my first house in Laurel Canyon on Wunderland Avenue somewhere in the mid-60s, I think, mid to late 60s. It was a house on Wunderland Avenue. I paid $240 a month for it. It was a gorgeous wooden cabin-like house with cathedral ceilings and a gigantic fireplace and an outdoor patio and a bedroom and kitchenette, and I just found myself there somehow. You know, you're drawn to places, you're drawn to people. And at the time, it was very affordable. Laurel Canyon was the least expensive canyon to live in. Coldwater and Benedict Canyon and the other canyons, well, that was, you know, getting closer to Beverly Hills and those people. This was the bohemian community. These were the artists. So when a house became available for that price, I started renting it. When I first moved in, I didn't think there was anything special about it. I just thought, it's just a beautiful environment. But as the weeks turned to months, and I started to meet my neighbors, and go down to the local country store to do my shopping, and to walk my Irish setter, and notice that the doors seemed to always be open to people's homes. And I would hear music coming through the windows, and people smiling and saying hello, and occasionally inviting me inside for a bite. I kind of felt I wasn't in Kansas anymore, or Los Angeles. The 5 minutes between the Sunset Strip and Laurel Canyon was the distance between two galaxies. There were two separate worlds, two separate mentalities, and it only took a month or 2 or 3 before I realized I was home.
So who was in Laurel Canyon at that time?
Who were my neighbors in Laurel Canyon at that time? Who did I see on the street and hang out with? Who was shopping at the local store or walking their dogs? My neighbors were, in no particular order, Linda Ronstadt, Joni Mitchell, John Mayall, David Cassidy, Mickey Dolenz, and his gorgeous wife Samantha. Frank Zappa, Cass Elliot, Timothy Leary, Governor Jerry Brown, the guys from Three Dog Night, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I think those were my immediate neighbors.
Oh, not so bad for
There had to have been a few dozen more, but at the time, they all just seemed like neighbors.
Well, that's kind of an interesting thing because obviously you work in the media, you work with the Paris Hiltons of the world and everything, where life is very different right now when it comes to celebrity. It's very closed off and it's very behind doors and no photos, no anything. What was it like at that time? Because these are, even at the time, they were still kind of either the biggest or becoming the biggest musicians in the world. But it wasn't like that, was it?
No. During the Laurel Canyon years and during the 60s, there wasn't this kind of wall or division between audience and performer. We were all in this together. There was a camaraderie of experience. Nobody was higher on the hill than anybody else. We were all in Laurel Canyon. You know, today, yes, I'm sure you could go to neighborhoods in Beverly Hills where big movie stars live and take bus tours, you know, to their homes and take pictures outside. But there are gates and security cameras and security people. And today's celebrities leave their homes in limousines behind darkened windows and do what they can to avoid fans or anybody who might interfere with them. In the Laurel Canyon days, we were a family. We were neighbors. In many ways, Laurel Canyon was a very traditional place. It was Americana. As strange as it might sound, I view it partially as a Norman Rockwell experience, where neighbors talked to neighbors, where you helped people out, where if there was a hitchhiker on the road, you gave him a ride. If you were a little behind in a rent payment, people would say, yeah, well, see you in a week or two. If you needed some extra food at the country store, extend the credit a bit. It didn't matter if the person was, quote, a celebrity, if the person had just did their first album, if Frank Zappa had just recorded Freak Out and it became the big cause celeb. If you saw Zappa or any people like him around, you just put your hand out and said, hello. I mean, I ran into Sonny and Cher that way, you know, when they would just show up on their motorcycles and pause at the store to pick something up and ask how it was going, what they were doing. It wasn't like meeting Sonny and Cher. It was about meeting your neighbors. So there was a friendship. It's very hard to explain because today, I don't know of communities like that. You literally could knock on somebody's door and say, I could use some extra sugar. Look, if you're looking for tales about sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Laurel Canyon, I promise you, you'll find them. You'll find them. And all of that was there and plentiful. I remember well. However, in addition to that component, there was the Wunderland School, which was a marvelous school for children. That there was truly a sense of community. There was a religiosity factor. There were spiritual enclaves. There was the Source Restaurant with Jim Baker, where there was a communal group that lived behind the Source.
Best biological protein for man is the sunflower seed. And this is what forms the basis of our protein, along with raw cheese.
You must have an overview or an overthought as to why more people are not vegetarians. Is it just lack of information, lack of knowledge on the subject? What holds people back, do you think?
I think most are victimized by their conditioned tastes. We don't find it necessary to kill another sentient thing for our food. God sets such a bountiful table that there's no need for it. It takes 21 pounds of grain, for example, to make 1 pound of beef. We would have more than enough food to feed the world many times over if everyone would become a vegetarian.
Joshua buys most of the food for the Brotherhood commune. Joshua, how much does it cost to live off of a vegetarian diet?
Basically about $1.50 to $2 a day. If everyone would just get together and in their neighborhood and just organize their buying, they could go down to the city market and buy their food at such a lower price than they would pay in the markets. They wouldn't have any, they wouldn't be going through a middleman. They'd just be going straight from the farmers.
So what you're suggesting is vegetarian co-ops?
Right.
The youngest of the young. You are the light in the way to liberation. Ooh la ooh la ooh la 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 ooh la ooh la la. Ooh la ooh la ooh la 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 ooh la ooh la la. Master of all vibration, prophet of the age. King of kings, Lord of mine, restorer of his name. Vibrating massive light, moving through the night, breaking up all the darkness that is in your sight. Ooh la ooh la ooh la la ooh la ooh la la. Ooh la ooh la ooh la 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 ooh la ooh la la. Ancient Lord of his wisdom, greatest white magician, mix your magic potion in my cup. Drink, drink, drink from my cup. Drink, drink, drink from my cup. Ooh la ooh la ooh la 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 ooh la ooh la la. Ooh
We believe in being harmless and happy and free.
Some very, very high beings. There were people who were very much involved in meditation. There were people tremendously involved in health way back then to just take hikes in Laurel Canyon. This was long before the days of, Runyon Canyon singles, walking, jogging tours. This was just taking walks in fresh air. And there was a great appreciation on holidays, Christmases and Thanksgivings, to go to people's homes where food would be prepared, traditionally served with people's parents and children. There was the constant presence, as you might even hear tonight, of dogs and cats. It wasn't all wild and crazy. And at times it was almost ecumenical. There was a sacredness about it. The people who lived in Laurel Canyon knew about Earth Day before Earth Day was created. We understood the value of the preservation of the environment. There were hills where the marigolds grew wild. You could drive up the street and go from home to home and smell the home-cooked tastings of people from all different cultures. It was a combination of being on the cutting edge of the new thing, but you were grounded in something that was inherently American.
Very good. Well, I know in talking with a lot of people, it sounds like, and Joni Mitchell talks about it in Ladies of the Canyon, but it sounds like, from what I've heard, some of the tales, there seem to have been 3 women in particular that really were the hostesses of the canyon. And it was Samantha Dolans, Mama Cass, and Gail Zappa. Can you talk a little bit about each of those women and kind of what they brought as far as the community there?
Joni Mitchell really got the title right when she spoke of the ladies of the canyon. And there truly were some very distinct ladies of the canyon. Yes, if you talk to Pamela DeBar, she will speak to you with her great eloquence about a certain kind of a lady who pursued a certain kind of man for perhaps a very specific purpose. There were also women who had a kind of sophisticated, liberated sense of purpose and being in the 60s. And for the first time, they were allowed to assert themselves. Let me tell you, the ladies of the canyon spoke up. You didn't mess around with them. They were loving, but strong and secure, and very clear with what they wanted and what they didn't want. And you never crossed that line. Samantha Dolans used to have these Thanksgiving lunches for what I refer to as the Laurel Canyon orphans. That simply meant people who didn't have families, who lived in Los Angeles during Thanksgiving. They had no place to go. And she would open up her home, this incredible home at the end of Horseshoe Canyon in Laurel Canyon, where she lived with Mickey. And she had family with her, and they had children. And she would set a table of the kind of traditional Thanksgiving meal that you would dream of as a child. And after you finished your third dessert, many a time Mickey and I would go into his recording studio afterwards and play with the equipment, and we did little radio plays between the two of us with microphones. We made recordings together. Samantha Dolans opened her heart and her home with charm and with grace. And my best Thanksgiving recollections, I think, were Laurel Canyon Thanksgiving meals with Samantha. What can you say about Mama Cass Elliot? I mean, not only was she a friend and a guest on a little television show I did on cable at the time, but she was another one of those people who would just open her heart, open her home, and she liked to feed people and she liked to eat. And when you went to see Cass, it was necessary for you to appear with an appetite, and she satiated it. The Zappas, it's funny how as the years pass, certain recollections are so crystal clear, others are more obscure. I remember going to Frank Zappa's house on a number of occasions, but I recall sitting in his at-home studio where he would be moving those things up and down and playing something new that he was working on or remastering something. He was a technical genius, and he lived at the top of Laurel Canyon. He lived where Laurel Canyon turned into Woodrow Wilson Drive, and he had one of the fancier houses. And I remember when Gail offered food and beverage, well, let's just say it's a little bit more uptown. It wasn't quite as funky. You know. The unnamed ladies of the canyon, the ones who were not celebrities, but who were just permanently entrenched in the culture, they served you hors d'oeuvres and wine and brownies. Do you want to explore that?
I think it's time for us to talk a little bit about the sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Laurel Canyon is both a location as well as a state of mind. And those of us now who reminisce about it with you are talking about a time a half a lifetime ago when things were much more innocent than they are today. Now, I can tell you that Laurel Canyon certainly had a large contingency of people who believed in indulging in recreational activities that would put a smile on your face. Laurel Canyon had an aroma about it.
Right?
When you drove up Laurel Canyon and turned left on Kirkwood Drive or Lookout Mountain, when you would go up into the tiny little areas of Blue Heights or Horseshoe Canyon, you would hear things. You would hear music coming out of windows. You would smell the wildflowers. You would smell the cooking. And there was another kind of an aroma that you would occasionally smell as well. And if you took a deep breath of it, Laurel Canyon assumed an even more three-dimensional appearance about it. Look, there's no secret that
Right.
It was the 1960s. It was the generation of the 1960s. We all grew up together. Many of us went to Woodstock or the Monterey Pop Festival, and clearly marijuana was a component of the community. And whatever one's position was on that issue, it just was. And when you went to people's homes and they served you a little appetizer in the form of a brownie or something else to munch on, things happened to you. And I'm certainly not comparing those times to this time. This time things are a lot more complicated and perhaps dangerous, but at that time, it was very innocent and eye-opening. And I think a case can be made when you ask, why did so much music and artistry emerge from this tiny enclave, which influenced the cultural tastes of the entire nation and beyond? Where did the inspiration come from? Well, I'd be a liar if I told you that a couple of brownies were not involved in the equation. In discussing the magical components of Laurel Canyon, one cannot deny that there was a certain sensual sense that was omnipresent. Now, keep in mind that this was at a time, 40 years ago, after the birth control pill, but before HIV. So one could express themselves in intimate manners without running the chance that it might kill you. It was a time of frivolity, joy. People laughed, they entertained, they made music, they danced, they fell in love, they fell in lust, they ate, they drank, they sometimes smoked, and from time to time, they made love. The women of Laurel Canyon were not objects. They were not treated as something less than men. They were very strong, very assertive, very creative women who were part of the Laurel Canyon experience. Just look at the few who emerged as being incredibly famous and successful. The Joni Mitchells of the world, I mean, that's the Linda Ronstadts, those aren't pushover type girls, you know. Just as there were groupies who were in search of rock and roll stars, or where does Jim Morrison live with those tight black leather pants? Of course, there was that, and there were those girls, and there will always be fans, and there were then as there are today. But the more liberated ladies of Laurel Canyon just said, you know, if I'm attracted to this man in this extraordinary environment, there are no rules, there are no boundaries, and they would plan to kiss on your cheek. So Laurel Canyon must not be perceived as a place where just a bunch of male rock stars took advantage of this bountiful grouping of potential goddesses. The women made the choices as much as the men made the choices. And that contributed also to the magic and the overall demeanor of the community. People walked around with smiles on their faces. We kind of knew how they got there.
I love it. Okay. So who were some of the people that you were spending the most time with, and what are some of the memories that really stand out for you?
I lived in two homes in Laurel Canyon, one on Wonderland Avenue and one at the very, very top of Kirkwood Drive. I'm a kind of reclusive guy, you know, by nature. I kind of hung out by myself a lot, and I did radio shows late at night, usually from 10 in the evening to 2 in the morning, interviewing people and being a disc jockey. So it wasn't like I threw a lot of parties. But I did have 2 parties that I recall when I turned 30 and when I turned 31. And I invited some of the neighbors and I invited some of my friends, and you know, I always try to resist the quote name-dropping element of the party, but I don't think there's a way of getting around dropping a name if you're going to talk about the people who were at the party. But I do recall that for my 30th birthday party, I wanted to do something unique in Laurel Canyon. I hosted a black tie party where I asked the guests to arrive in tuxedos for the men and gowns for the ladies. And to my absolute surprise, I didn't know what I was thinking, there they were in the house. Between my 30th and my 31st birthday party, who showed up for those parties? Well, Alice Cooper, Dick Clark, David Cassidy, Sal Mineo, John and Yoko, Ray Bradbury, Theodore Sturgeon, Buffy St. Marie, Phil Oakes, Harry Nielsen, Mickey Dolenz, 20 or 30 others. And not all of them wore tuxedos, of course, you know, but they chilled. And a party, of course, in Laurel Canyon would begin at an appropriate hour, 10 or 11 in the evening, and would end a day or two after the party began. I have fond memories of my 30th and 31st birthday. And considering my age, to have a memory of 30 or 31 is probably an accomplishment. My friends were both the famous names that you're aware of, and people who were somewhat anonymous. One of my neighbors was on the Hollywood blacklist, you know, a great screenplay writer, a man who wrote a marvelous book that was turned into a movie called On the Beach, who was blacklisted from Hollywood. He was a pal of mine. Some of my friends in Laurel Canyon were craftsmen, great carpenters, people who could teach you how to build a little extra room to your house, but not pay a whole lot of attention to building codes. You know, you need a home, you go down to Home Depot, pick up some lumber, and you can put something together. People who were expert, instead of using retaining walls against mountains because of mudslides, taught you how to build walls out of broken concrete. It's how stones are placed in a way that hold back erosion. Some of those roads were built in Rome at 1,000 years ago that still hold, and there are some houses that stay on top of mountains in Laurel Canyon because they're built on top of pieces of broken concrete stacked in a very special way. Freemasons who would teach you some of the tricks of construction. Craftsmen, carpenters who lived in Laurel Canyon, who would come up and do the cabinetry work or build the gazebo or the walkway. People who showed you how to build steps that led up these little canyon trails to your house. But the steps were built out of railroad ties and rebar. I had friends in the canyon from every one of these groups of people. There wasn't a difference between a qualified tradesman and carpenter and accomplished musician. They were all drawn to the canyon.
Do you recall what, in talking about carpenters, there was one carpenter who became quite famous later on. Do you recall seeing Harrison Ford running around? He apparently built everybody's cabinets, and when he wasn't doing that, he was selling the Doors pot.
See, Tina, one of the marvelous things about sitting and speaking with people about Laurel Canyon is that no matter how long I lived there and how well I thought I knew all the tales, whenever I have these conversations, somebody tells me something completely new.
Right.
No, I did not know that Harrison Ford was a carpenter in Laurel Canyon who did what he did. I sometimes see him jogging here on Mulholland Drive, but I did not know that. I remember buying a brake front at the Antique Guild, this piece of furniture that you put in the dining room where you kept silverware and dishes and things like that. It was priced reasonably. And a delivery person came by a few days later to put it in the house and introduced himself as Edward James Olmos. Charming guy. I think I tipped him $10 or $15 for bringing the brake front to my house. It would be probably 15, 20 years later that I would be in Miami representing Don Johnson when Mr. Olmos was in Miami Vice. And he reminded me of that tale I had forgotten. I wonder how many people whose names we know now began as unidentifiable people in their Laurel Canyon days and have yet to come forward.
Right.
Be nice if they did.
It's very interesting to me that we all look up to celebrities and our eyes are wide open and full of stars. Back at that time, a lot of the celebrities, and big-named celebrities, the rock stars were their rock stars too, and they were hanging around with them. Can you talk about some of the celebrities that you'd see hanging around, like the Nicholsons and all of that?
Whenever you went to a, quote, rock star party, you would see the actors and the actresses. Because the stars of that time, the real superstars, were the musicians. It probably could be argued that that's still the case. I'm not certain, but it was then. This is for sure. It wasn't before Laurel Canyon. In other words, before Laurel Canyon and before the rock musician became the superstar, well, the superstar was Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe. They were actors and actresses, but they lived in a different part of town. Now the musicians came in and they shook everything up and attracted. So yes, did I see the Jack Nicholsons and the Don Johnsons, the Dennis Hoppers, the Peter Fondas, the people who were not musicians but were drawn to the experience of music. Saw them all the time. And they fit seamlessly into the party, the mix, and the community. See, we didn't distinguish. In those days, it wasn't who's in the room that's a rock star, who's in the room that's a movie star, who's in the room that does stained glass windows, who's in the room that fixes cars or paints Volkswagens in psychedelic colors. We were just happy to be in the room. Laurel Canyon was a very, very large and colorful room.
The night, I know that Mickey Dolenz told me about a very special night where John Lennon was over. He got a phone call from Brian Wilson's manager, and at the time Brian had not left the house in a few years. He said he was going to come up and wanted to jam with them. They didn't believe it, and sure enough, he pulls up and was there in his bathrobe and his slippers. I asked Samantha about that, and she said, "Yeah, there were a few people that were there," and she said, "If John Lennon was there, that means Elliot was probably there." Do you remember that night? Do you remember being in those jam sessions or anything like that?
It's funny that It's that old line that anybody who remembers the 60s probably weren't there.
Right.
I don't recall that night. When John was in Los Angeles during his lost weekend period, I saw him frequently, almost every day. And he was a guest at my house many times. And from time to time I would drive him to different places because he did not know how to drive a car. I was not at Mickey and Samantha's home the night in question. However, why not? John loved Harry Nielsen. I introduced John to David Cassidy in Laurel Canyon. I remember one morning I was just about ready to go to sleep. It was around 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And I heard somebody outside the door shouting, "Elliot, Elliot." Yes. Who's there? He says, "It's me, it's John. I'm here with my son Julian. Julian came to LA. I'm going to take him to Disneyland. I want you to meet my boy." And I invited John and a very, very young Julian, I don't know, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, to come in. John had been up all night long, and he was ready to take Julian to Disneyland. Julian had a fascination with a telescope that I had in my living room, and he looked at it, looked through it. I don't remember taking John to many houses in Laurel Canyon, but I wasn't with him all the time. Couldn't keep tabs on him during that time. And by the way, I have great love and respect and admiration for Mickey Dolenz. He was one of my real pals. He and I spent some quality time together at his home, at the old Troubadour Bar, and a couple of other places that I'd rather not identify. And if he said it happened, I'm not here to say it didn't.
Gotcha. Well, you know, there seemed to be a little bit of a British invasion kind of come over Laurel Canyon, and there was a place that everyone talks about. It's now Pache. It was at that time the Cat and the Fiddle, and it was kind of a British pub. Do you have memories of being there, or who was kind of coming in from across the pond and spending some time there?
I remember this. There was a conversion. What is they refer to as the British invasion, because most of the people who I grew up with in Laurel Canyon, for one reason or another, were Americans, you know, and they spoke fairly clearly. And there came a time where suddenly there would be more British people with Liverpudlian accents and other accents, Irish accents. I think the first time I met Donovan was in Laurel Canyon. And of course they all mixed together perfectly. There was no nationalistic distinction. But this little club restaurant called the Cat and Fiddle opened at the bottom of Kirkwood, where Laurel Canyon converges with it. And I went in it one evening, and I saw a dartboard on the wall. It was the first time I saw a real dartboard. And there was some Brits who were taking these strange arrow things, and looked like little sparrows with big sharp noses, and going and receiving great pleasure from this experience. They would have a pint or two, and I mean, to me it was not like the Olympics, the most compelling of sports, but there seemed to be more British people and British musicians. And the food that was being served was closer to fish and chips than burgers and fries. And it was good. It was really good. Laurel Canyon was open to people of all blends and all mixtures. However, out of fairness, upon reflection, one of my regrets was that it was a white community. There were very few black people in Laurel Canyon, and very few black musicians. I don't know why. It seemed odd then. It feels odd today.
You know what, and I'm going to touch on it just a second. I do want to, before I forget, I'm curious, for someone like a John Lennon, who's used to more of a city type life and everything, what did he think about Laurel Canyon? Did he ever mention that he liked coming to Laurel Canyon because, why?
John was an honorary New Yorker. New York became his second home after England. And his excursions in LA, which have been well documented in other places, was during a time of his life when it was not great. He was a guest at my home. His son Julian was a guest at my home. Sean Lennon would come out and visit me on summers in my house. All the Lennons stayed with me from time to time. I think that the appeal that LA, the canyons, and Laurel Canyon had to John was a place where he would not be disturbed. When John and Yoko came to my 31st birthday, they walked into the house. There were 20 or 30 other people there. People treated them as just two other guests. Again, Laurel Canyon was not the home of celebrity, of superstar. It was more of a family. And if you were, an internationally known being, that's so comforting. In my subsequent life as a media consultant traveling the world with superstars, I see what happens when somebody of enormous fame walks into a room and how the room ceases to be the way it was a minute before, and everything is ruined. In the Laurel Canyon days, whoever showed up would just be invited to come in, hang out, have a brownie.
Exactly. And now what you mentioned was very interesting about the fact that it wasn't very racially mixed at that time. We did have some amazing musicians there, though, who were kind of breaking some boundaries and having racially mixed groups, which is so strange to us to hear today. But a group like Love was groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what was that like for the residents? Because I'm sure at that time you craved that racial mix. You wanted that immersion. And you see a group like Love come along. What did that mean to people here?
When members of Love appeared in Laurel Canyon, and I also think you could add Buddy Miles to that list as well, although I'm not certain. Or occasionally you would go to somebody's home and there'd be one or two black people who were what we refer to as session musicians, a great saxophonist or keyboard player, etc., whose name might not be instantly known. Yes, they did stand out. It was the 60s. It was still a city of racial divide, as I believe it is today. They were welcome. One of the things that was missing from the Laurel Canyon years was jazz. When you drove up and down the canyons, you did not hear jazz. If you heard the blues, it was being sung by Janice, not Aretha. Laurel Canyon in many ways was reflective of the changes that we were going through in America at the time. There was a political consciousness as well in Laurel Canyon. These were not people who were just spaced out on marijuana, listening to rock and roll music and having wild, crazy sex. That is not what the Canyon was about. Anybody who pretends to paint it that way did not know what they were talking about. It was a time of tremendous social consciousness, some upheaval, protests against the Vietnam War, and people who were vitally involved in their community as being part of the American experience. There weren't a lot of black people there.
Something that was really interesting that Johnny Eccles talked about was he felt like everyone kind of felt like they were on, maybe Mark Bowman said this, they were on the verge of real change, and real change was happening, and then there came a time where they felt like they failed. It didn't make its way as completely as everyone wanted to see it. Do you think that there's a lesson for today's generation to look back during that time and what the musicians were saying in their songs, that there's maybe some hope that a new generation can kind of come along and pick up where Laurel Canyon left off?
Tina, that's a very profound question. It's the most meaningful question, and the one that gives me pause to reflect and think, because it's just so essential that this be expressed in some kind of meaningful soundbite that gets past your editor. Give me a moment. We were all dreamers at the time. Some of us were visionaries. Some of us were behind the 8 ball. Some of us were just one step ahead in terms of the cultural progression of music and changing social mores in America. And yes, we believed we would change the world. And love and peace and the way we lived in that little community was our vision for the global picture. If it could be done among us, it could be done among everyone. The 1960s ended somewhere in the mid-1970s. It's hard to explain that, but it lasted longer than the numbers suggested. We thought we could end wars. We thought that music would be the universal healing force. We believed that you could go to sleep every night and leave your back door open. There were no closed circuit cameras. There were no electric gates. There was an openness and a friendliness and a warmth. And the music that Laurel Canyon was pumping out reinforced that vision. Well, there came a time when Laurel Canyon no longer lived up to the vision that all of us had of it. Something changed. What changed, of course, was America, the world. Some of us may have grown up. Others may have abandoned their dreams. Some decided, hey, let's take this music and see if we can make a couple of bucks off of it. It's not just about the music. Let's also hire a business manager and an accountant and discuss the publishing rights. During that transition, I remember a sense of despondency falling over the hillside, that the Laurel Canyon dream, love and peace and sharing with everybody, may have been a bit naive. No, I still embrace those concepts. That's just Elliot Mintz. I'm sure there are Laurel Canyonites who feel that in their hearts and souls. But yeah, we fell a little short of our mark because our intentions superseded our realities. You can't always get what you want. You
try sometimes. Something that's really interesting to me is that it seems like for a moment in time, you guys really achieved it, though. In that moment, in that place, you really achieved a really beautiful, peaceful environment. Would you say that you guys had it there? It was there.
We had it. It was there. What you imagined you could live. And anybody who you speak with who were part of that experience at that time, in that place, had a taste of what the whole world could be like. Because if it could happen in a canyon, in a community, in the second largest city in America, why couldn't it happen everywhere? And if you listen to the messages of those songs and the writings of those, look, we all always felt we were so close to it being the way we wanted to live it. I'm older now. I assume that many of the people on your program are older now. But I'm not cynical, and I don't regret any of the experiences of the Laurel Canyon years. And the best of us carry with us the fundamental social, moral, spiritual, socioeconomic, sexual mentality of the way we lived our lives. And it's a kind of a part of a Jackson Browne song, that's what's remembered when all else is done. It's the way we lived our lives. If you lived in Laurel Canyon in the 60s and the 70s, you lived your life in an honorable, truthful, idealistic manner. And no one can ever take that card back from you.
Well, I look at Laurel Canyon at that time, and I look at today, and I can't help but think the more things change, the more they stay the same. How important do you think it is for today's generation to take a look at Laurel Canyon at that time and to study what was happening and to make their own changes?
It would be a mistake for people to listen to your reportage and for them to say, oh, well, look, these are just the reminiscences of a bunch of burnt-out hippies who lived an illusionary existence without any responsibility or meaningfulness. And times have passed. And by the way, I need a job. And they might be listening to different kinds of music right now and living their lives with different objectives. If I could say anything to them, the fundamental core of joy, of sharing, of optimism, of peace, integrity, backing up what you say you can do, assisting your neighbor. The values of the Laurel Canyon dream, myth, or experience could serve as a teaching, a touchstone for the way you live your life today. You know, Tina, at the end of the day, the Laurel Canyon community were people who were led by their hearts and their souls, not unlike their great-grandparents. They knew what was right and wrong. They knew what was good. That can be replicated today. You just got to travel a little further. Trust a little bit more. Be a little bit more inherently optimistic the way this community was. Because during those turbulent years that so many of the people on this program lived in Laurel Canyon, America was going through some extraordinarily difficult times, you know? Assassination of presidents and war and divisiveness, and we got through it. But we have not finished the journey. So Laurel Canyon might be a different place, and the people who live there may live different kinds of lives. But the lessons of the experience are eternal. And I do not doubt that today's generation of people who are more on Twitter than at Laurel Canyon parties are hungry for that. That today's generation are tired of being numb. Resist the idea of just being used, you know, for data mining or whatever it is. You should have been there. And I don't doubt, secretly, around America today, there are small enclaves. There are little Laurel Canyons. There are places where people really are living, loving each other, being supportive of each other. Every time you turn on the news and you see a disaster of some kind that occurred in a little town, a fire or a flood or something, and you see people rolling out to help, that's an extension of the thing we're talking about. There were fires in Laurel Canyon. When the fires occurred, sure, we dialed 911, but while waiting for the firefighters, we went out with garden hoses. We kicked in windows to take out dogs and cats if their owners were out of town. If there were floods and mudslides in Laurel Canyon, you got out and you did what you could to put boards up to prevent the mud from seeping into the living room. We looked after each other. Well, this is America, and that dream is not dead.
Before I ask you my final question, is there anything that you thought about that came to mind when we were going to do this interview that you thought that you wanted to share with us?
I think the recollections of the people who you have spoken with about Laurel Canyon are all very valid and very meaningful. There is something that we all miss. And those are the experiences that cannot be expressed in words, or anecdotes, or sound bites. It is something that I don't think any of us have ever really gotten in touch with. And upon reflection, we can't even resurrect the recollections. There was something else about Laurel Canyon. People have referred to it as a vortex. People have referenced having telepathic experiences. People have referenced talking about UFOs, about seances at the Houdini Castle, about things that could have gone terribly wrong, but worked out okay. I think that there was something mystical, and if I could indulge myself, almost divine, about that place at that time. We were all aboard spaceship Laurel Canyon. It was our yellow submarine. There was some kind of cosmic glue that held us all together. The magic that came out of Laurel Canyon through the music could not have occurred without some force that I'm just not capable of articulating that intervened. So at the end of the day, you had to have been there. If you watch this program and say, well, this thing's very interesting, I'm going to take a ride through Laurel Canyon and see what it's like. You might not feel it. You might not get it, because you had to have been there and been touched by something that none of us can truly recall.
I can tell you do still feel it. As somebody that didn't live it, I take many weekends when I don't have something to do for a couple of hours and drive around there. You still feel it. It's there. And actually, Johnny Eccles said it beautifully, where he talked about if you rip away the floorboards, if you scrub away the dirt, the aura is still there and you can really feel it. It was beautiful what he said about that.
Well, Johnny, of course, can express these things far better than I.
No, you say things beautifully, and I want you to talk about what you were saying upstairs, that Laurel Canyon gives you something, that Laurel Canyon, that you can't walk away without being touched.
Obviously, I no longer live in Laurel Canyon. Interesting enough, I live less than 7 miles from Laurel Canyon. We could walk out on my deck and look and see a big cell tower, which is at the top of Laurel Canyon. You can move from Laurel Canyon, but Laurel Canyon never leaves you. It follows you. It touches people, and it gives back. So the people who lived through this time and place, who honored what I consider to be sacred land, you know, this was kind of the Hopi territory of Los Angeles in the 60s, as seen through the eyes of musical Angelinos. And we all took much from the mountain and the hills. But I can assure you that the hills and the canyons bestowed upon each of us something so memorable and life-affirming and eternal that it would not do justice by attempting to put it into words.
Very good. And I just want to ask, I know you said you moved away from Laurel Canyon. Do you regret it?
Tina, about A year or two ago, I was at a party, and I ran into some fellow who said to me, hi, I just wanted to introduce myself. You're Elliot Mintz, right? And I said, yes. And he said his name, and he said, I bought your old house in Laurel Canyon. And I love living there. And if you ever want to come back to visit it, to just see it, here's my number. I had not been back to my old house in 25 years. That's how long I've been away from Laurel Canyon. And I thought about what, what that experience would be like for me. Because, of course, upon reflection, lots of us romanticize the experiences of our youth and our past. What if I went back and it wasn't the same? What if I felt nothing? And I said, yeah, I'd like that. And within the past 24 months, I drove up Kirkwood Drive, and this gentleman was kind enough to invite me in and let me just be by myself to walk around and look at things and see the view as I saw it, recall some experiences that I lived through all those years. It was as magical and breathtaking as it was when I lived there. Returning to that house was like having a reunion with an old friend. I still felt seller's remorse. I never should have let her go. And anyone of the Laurel Canyon expatriates who moved on with their lives to different places, when they look over their shoulder and remember that time and that magical place, will remember her with great fondness and reverence. Those are my thoughts about Laurel Canyon.